All right, let's dive in. We're taking a deep dive today into Precolonial Black Africa by Cheikh Anta Diop.
Yeah, a really fascinating book.
It really is one of those books that kind of shakes up how we think about African societies before colonialism.
Definitely. And
Hmm.
Diop doesn't just like retell events.
Yeah.
He digs deep into the social structures, the politics,
Systems, yeah.
the systems at play, and he compares them to what was happening in Europe at the same time, which is
That's what I found so interesting, that side-by-side comparison.
exactly. And
Yeah.
what he finds, what Diop uncovers, is a ton of evidence that challenges that common view of pre-colonial Africa as somehow less developed
Right.
than Europe.
Less sophisticated.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack some of that evidence. One of the things that really grabbed my attention was how Diop deals with caste systems in Africa, specifically with the Wolof people
Okay.
of pre-colonial Senegal.
This is what gets really interesting, because when we think of caste, we often think of these rigid hierarchies. Right. But Diop's research shows a much more nuanced picture.
So it wasn't just like top-down, everybody in their place kind of thing.
Not at all. Take the Badolo, for example.
Okay.
These were individuals considered slaves.
Right.
But get this. They could actually rise in rank, own property, even hold positions in the military.
Wait, slaves in the military, that's pretty unexpected.
It is, right. The Wolof cavalry was mainly nobles, but the infantry, the guys on the front lines, often made up of the Dolo.
Wow. So the concept of slave here wasn't as simple as we might think.
Not at all. And then you have the Nyano,
Okay.
the freemen. They were another part of that Wolof social structure.
Right.
And what Diop's suggesting is that these divisions were more about specialization within the society.
So like different roles, different groups playing specific roles instead of just like a strict hierarchy.
Precisely. It's like a complex web,
Yeah.
rather than just a simple ladder. And that's one of Diop's big points. These African societies were way more dynamic, more fluid than a lot of historical accounts give them credit for.
Okay, so we've got the surprising fluidity within the caste system, but Diop also takes us through some, incredible ancient African empires like Ghana, Mali, Songhai.
Oh, empires that were vast.
Vast and well-organized, too.
And well-organized. Think about Mansa Musa's court in Mali, as described by that traveler Ibn Battuta, gold-covered windows, silk-draped thrones, musicians, storytellers.
Wow. Centuries ago, and this level of
Opulence?
and organization, it's like, why don't we hear more about these empires?
It makes you wonder, right? And it wasn't just about that outward display. Either Diop goes into the administrative structure of these empires, the officials responsible for everything from military matters to governing provinces.
Yeah, so these weren't just, random kingdoms scattered across the land.
They
had
thought systems of governance. For instance, they had the Dinakoi, the generalissimo,
Okay.
responsible for the military. The Dundee acted as governors. And even a Barakoi, who was in charge of the slaves.
That's interesting. They had specific roles.
Oh, yeah.
For managing even the slave population.
Right.
It makes you think about how integral they were to society, even if they had a different status.
Exactly. And what Diop really emphasizes is that historical consciousness, the continuity within these empires. He gives the example of the Tintori.
Okay.
It was a symbol of power that was passed down through generations of rulers, which shows a deep awareness of their history.
It really challenges that whole notion that these were primitive or disorganized societies.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder why this stuff isn't more widely known,
Yeah, it really does.
Well, maybe this deep dive will help with that.
I hope so.
Now, the book also explores the arrival and spread of Islam in Black Africa.
Yeah.
And this is where things get even more interesting, right?
Oh, yeah, because, you see, Islam didn't come in as a conquering force, not like it did in some other parts of the world.
Okay.
It spread peacefully, often adopted by rulers,
Interesting.
and integrated with existing belief systems.
So more of a blending than a clash.
Yeah, a blending of cultures. And that had a huge impact on how these societies developed.
Yeah.
Take Aske Muhammad, for instance.
Right.
The guy goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca,
Right.
all about peace and reflection, right?
Right.
Comes back, declares a holy war.
Oh, wow. That's quite a change of pace. So what was he after with this holy war?
Well, he used that religious authority he'd gained to push for administrative unity within the empire.
So it's like religion became a tool for political reform in a way.
Exactly. And it shows how leaders throughout history have used religion to achieve their goals, whether for unity, expansion, whatever.
Right, right. You always have to look deeper, right? It's rarely as simple as it seems on the surface.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what I appreciate about Diop's work. He presents the evidence and lets you draw your own conclusions.
Speaking of evidence, this book sheds light on a whole other side of pre-colonial Africa that often gets ignored. The intellectual traditions. And I'm not just talking about oral histories here. We're talking written records, centers of learning.
Absolutely. One of the most amazing examples is the University of Sankore.
Yeah.
In Timbuktu.
In Timbuktu. This is amazing, I mean.
It is. Diop really gets into the structure, the rigorous teaching methods, the variety of subjects they covered.
Wow.
They even awarded diplomas. Can you believe that?
It's mind-blowing, right? It really changes how we think about knowledge creation, you know? It wasn't just a European thing.
Right. These vibrant intellectual centers were there in Africa centuries ago.
So we're talking about a level of intellectual rigor and historical consciousness that's just completely left out of most history books.
Absolutely. Diop's pushing back against that Eurocentric view.
Right.
That all knowledge just sprung up in Europe.
It's so important to broaden our understanding of history, to see it from multiple perspectives, and Diop's work definitely does that.
For sure.
I mean, he takes us beyond those stereotypes and reveals a world of complex social structures, powerful empires, and rich intellectual traditions.
And he doesn't just make claims, he backs it all up.
Right.
With historical accounts, linguistic evidence, archaeology.
It's like a reminder that history's not just one story. It's a tapestry woven from so many threads. And Diop helps us see those threads that have often been, you know, hidden or just ignored.
Yeah.
So we've covered caste systems, empires, Islam, intellectualism quite a lot. But what about the economic side of things? How did these societies function? What did trade look like?
Well, picture this. Bustling market cities, places like Timbuktu and Janneh, with trade networks crisscrossing the whole African continent.
That's what I'm talking about.
A vibrant hub of commerce, cultural exchange.
I can almost hear the sounds, smell the spices, see the textile. So what were some of the goods being traded in these markets?
Oh, everything. Salt, gold, cowries, textiles, even hippopotamus hides.
Hippopotamus hides, wow.
You name it. And they had sophisticated systems in place, currency, trade regulations.
So it wasn't just a simple barter system.
No, not at all. Gold dust was common, but they also used cowries and even usable squares of fabric as currency.
Usable squares of fabric, that's amazing. It really shows how differently they thought about value.
Right.
And exchange, you know, and it challenges our modern assumptions about economic development.
For sure.
Yeah.
These weren't primitive barter systems.
Yeah.
These were complex networks with their own unique ways of doing things.
It really highlights how interconnected the world was even back then. You know, Africa wasn't isolated. It was a vital part of global trade and exchange.
A vital part. And, you know, another fascinating thing Diop points out is that a landowning feudal system, like in Europe,
right,
it just didn't develop in Black Africa.
That is interesting. So how did their economic systems differ and what kind of impact did that have?
Well, Diop doesn't give a definitive answer, but he asks some thought-provoking questions, you know. Why was this the case? What other paths might development have taken if colonialism hadn't disrupted things?
It's like one of those what-if moments in history.
Yeah.
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
Absolutely.
And it speaks to Diop's bigger point about rethinking our assumptions.
Yeah.
Considering multiple perspectives on history.
Absolutely.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive so far.
It really has.
We've debunked myths, explored different narratives, gained a much deeper appreciation for the complexity of pre-colonial Africa.
For sure, for sure.
All right, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've learned.
Yeah, good idea.
We'll be back in a jiffy to continue our journey through pre-colonial Black Africa. Welcome back. We're deep in our exploration of Cheikh Anta Diop's pre-colonial Black Africa.
It's amazing what we've already uncovered.
Yeah, and all this really sets the stage for Diop's main point that African societies developed in these complex ways.
Right.
Totally independent of Europe, you know. And in many ways, he argues, comparable or even more advanced than Europe during the same periods.
That's right.
Now, this next part really made me think, Diop argues that Black Africa not having a landowning feudal system, like Europe did, might have actually been a good thing.
Interesting.
It seems counterintuitive, right? Because we usually think of feudalism as like a stepping stone to more advanced societies.
That's a traditional narrative.
But Diop challenges that. He points out that feudalism, with all its hierarchy and ties to the land, can stifle social mobility, economic innovation.
It can really hold things back.
So instead of everyone being tied to the land and their social position, People in Black Africa were freer to move around, specialize in different trades, engage in commerce.
Right, without all those feudal restrictions.
It's like a different path to development.
Exactly. And this ties back to Diop's emphasis on understanding African history on its own terms.
Yeah.
You can't just apply European models to Africa and expect them to fit.
Like trying to force a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
Those European models just don't make sense in the African context.
But they don't. And it makes you think, what other paths could development have taken?
Right.
If colonialism hadn't happened?
That's a big question.
It is, and it's one that's still relevant today as African nations figure out their own futures.
So Diop's saying, let's throw out those old assumptions. Consider the possibility that African societies might have developed along completely different lines with their own systems and structures. It's a challenging idea, but it makes you think.
It does. It's not about romanticizing the past, but recognizing the complexity of these societies, how they function in their own ways.
Now, to illustrate this point, Diop contrasts Black Africa and Europe throughout the book. He explains how in Europe the rise of cities and a merchant class led to the decline of feudalism and the emergence of capitalism. But he argues that in Black Africa, without that strong landowning class, the type of capitalism that developed in Europe wouldn't have been a natural fit.
Right. It's not about one being better or worse.
Right.
It's about understanding the different paths, the factors that shaped those differences. And these insights can help us understand contemporary Africa, too.
I see what you mean.
Especially as so many nations are dealing with the legacies of colonialism.
Right.
And trying to find their own ways forward.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how much we miss when we just look at history from a Eurocentric perspective.
It really has.
We've debunked myths, considered alternative narratives, and come away with a much deeper appreciation for the richness and diversity of pre-colonial Africa.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the key takeaways from pre-colonial Black Africa is that African history isn't just one story.
Right.
There were so many different kingdoms, empires, societies.
Each with their own thing going on.
With their own unique characteristics and development.
Diop gives us a glimpse into that incredible diversity.
He does.
And encourages us to dig deeper, to go beyond those generalizations and really explore this often overlooked part of history.
That's right.
Speaking of uncovering those hidden stories, Diop also talks about the Talibé, which are, well, kind of a head-scratcher.
A little bit, yeah, from a Western point of view.
They really highlight a concept that's almost paradoxical to us.
Go on.
Okay, so in European history, you often see religious figures amassing wealth and power, right?
Right. Think of the church in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, hugely influential, not just in religion, but in politics and economics, too.
Shaping entire systems.
But Diop claims that in Black Africa, at least according to his research, the Talibé didn't do that. They didn't amass wealth or challenge existing power structures.
So almost the opposite of what we see in Europe.
Yeah, it's a really different picture. What's fascinating here is the emphasis on spiritual devotion and knowledge rather than material possessions.
So instead of worldly power, these religious figures were focused on spiritual growth and the well-being of their communities.
It seems that way.
Makes you think about the different ways religion can shape a society, right?
It does. And again, it reinforces Diop's point about understanding African history on its own terms. He's not saying one way is better, just that they're fundamentally different.
Right.
Okay, so we've got these Talibé who kind of defy our expectations. But then Diop brings up this concept of retribalization.
Okay.
What did he mean by that?
Retribalization, as Diop describes it, was a process of social reorganization that happened in Black Africa, especially after the slave trade.
You can imagine the disruption, the trauma.
Communities torn apart, families separated.
Horrible.
Retribalization was about rebuilding, adapting in the face of that.
So finding strength and unity after such a horrific experience.
Exactly. It involved forming new social groups.
Okay.
Strengthening those existing kinship ties. Diop even uses data from historical censuses.
Interesting.
To show how families separated by the slave trade slowly regrouped, reestablished themselves.
It's like they were piecing their communities back together, drawing on those traditional kinship structures for support.
Exactly. It's remarkable, isn't it?
It is. And it wasn't just about clinging to the past. It was about adapting, finding ways to maintain social cohesion,
Right?
ensuring the survival of their culture and traditions.
A testament to their resilience.
Absolutely. Even in the face of such adversity, they found ways to persevere.
They did.
Yeah.
And, this idea of retribalization resonates with a lot of discussions today about identity and belonging,
I can see that.
especially for people of African descent who are reconnecting with their heritage.
Right, reclaiming their history.
It's like Diop's work, even though it's about the past, has these connections to what's happening now.
It does. It reminds us that history isn't just static facts.
Yeah.
It's alive, it's dynamic.
It's always shaping how we see ourselves and the world.
Wow, this deep dive into pre-colonial Black Africa has been quite a journey.
It really has.
It's like Diop gave us a whole new way to look at history.
He really challenges you to rethink everything you thought you knew about Africa before colonialism.
For sure. And one of the things I found fascinating was how he compares Black Africa and Europe throughout the book. He's not afraid to highlight those differences, in how they developed in their social structures.
And remember how we were talking about the Taliban earlier?
Oh, yeah, those religious figures.
Yeah, and how different their role was compared to, say, religious leaders in Europe.
Right, it was almost the opposite. It seemed like they were more focused on spiritual growth and community well-being.
Exactly. And that actually brings up a really interesting point about how Diop looks at the idea of revolution in the context of Black Africa.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Well, he argues that in European history, revolution usually means a complete overthrow of the existing power structures.
Right, like the French Revolution.
Exactly, a total upheaval. But Diop suggests that this kind of revolutionary model doesn't really fit with Black Africa.
Interesting. So you're saying that change happened differently there?
He thinks so. He believes change and progress in Black Africa happened more gradually, more organically.
Less about violent uprisings, more about adaptation and integration.
Precisely. And he points to the lack of a feudal system in Black Africa as a key reason for this.
Right, because without that rigid landowning class, there wasn't that same kind of class struggle that fueled those revolutions in Europe.
Exactly. It's like they were operating on a different foundation, which led to a different path of development.
This has been such an eye-opening experience. This book has truly changed how I view history, and I definitely want to learn more.
Me too. It's one of those books that sparks your curiosity and makes you think critically.
So as we wrap up this incredible deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this?
I think Diop's work reminds us that history isn't just a set of facts and dates.
Right.
It's a living narrative, constantly evolving as we find new evidence and look at things from different angles.
It's about questioning the stories we've been told, challenging those assumptions, and seeking out those untold stories that can really change how we see the past.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'll say farewell. Keep those minds curious, keep those hearts open, and keep diving deep into the world around you. You never know what amazing discoveries are waiting out there.